Hello, everybody. Let's see. Hello. How are we, everybody? It is good to see you. I was going to. Hello, hello. Welcome. If you're just popping on, say hello, whether or not you're live or watching this on replay later. Say hi. Happy Wednesday. I apologize for being a few minutes late. I was going to try to get fancy and the fancy didn't want to work. So stopped getting fancy. And we're here. So welcome on this Wednesday afternoon to this mini workshop to help you rewire your brain to move from inner critic to inner cheerleader. Here is what you need for our time together. You need a piece of paper or a journal and a writing implement because we are going to get interactive. I'm going to make you work. So there's that, making sure that I have all the things. All right. So, how are we? What I'm going to start with is this question, right? This question of who has an inner critic? Who has been hearing that voice recently? Anyone? Yes, I know. Our inner critic voice is strong. And my sense is that for many of us, it has been really, really loud lately. And so, my hope is that today we will get to know that inner critic just a little bit better so that then you can rewire the brain to transform it into your inner cheerleader. Hello, you do. Hello, Eleni, right? Yeah, you are not alone. So there's that. So to get us started, I'm going to just pull back and give you a little bit of context. You all know this is what I do. And a lot of my clients, when we're talking, whether these are individual clients or Thrive Circle clients, there is this sense of perfectionism, this sense of drive, this sense of striving. And the thing that I often ask the question, right? What might get in your own way? And the usual answer, and this is my answer too when my coach asked me this, is it's me, right? Or it's them. And it's not because we can't do the things we want to do. It's because our brain, our thoughts, is always telling us stories. And how lovely would it be if the stories that our brain always offered us were positive and cheerful, and they're not. And here's the thing, I'm not sure it's bad that they're not. And that might sound surprising to you, right? Yes, it would be really lovely if the very first voice you heard was the inner cheerleader, the encourager, the supporter. And yet, my hope is that today we shed some light on why this inner critic might just be information and why part of this rewiring process might be in allowing that part of your voice, that part of your brain to exist, right? Rather than wishing it didn't. Okay. So that's a little bit of context of why I think this conversation is so important. The other thing that I want to offer you is that this is not a light switch kind of practice. This is not a one and done, yep, I've thought about this. My inner critic is gone. It's not how it works. If you watched yesterday, I did just a quick little nudge here in the group saying that this is like building a muscle, and muscles need frequent and consistent tending to stay strong. It's just the way it goes. And so our inner critic and our inner cheerleader thrive only when we nurture and nourish them. And that cuts both ways. And I would offer you that many of us nurture and nourish our inner critic. That's why it's so strong. Okay. So that's some of the context. Um, I'm really good at helping people check in with their inner critic because I've had a really strong inner critic and I still do, right? And it's not about again, making it go away, but it's befriending that inner critic so that you can start to notice what's there for you. So, to begin, what I would love for you to do is if you don't have a piece of paper handy, grab a piece of paper because you're going to do some reflecting, right? I'd like you to think about, what does your inner critic like to say to you? Right? What are the thoughts, the judgments, the things that your inner critic has been saying to you recently? Right? And take a few moments to just write that down, jot it down, right? Really allow yourself to hear that voice for a moment, maybe even feel it. It'll be okay. I promise you won't stay here that long. But give yourself permission to notice the voice of that inner critic and hear what it has to say. What are the words that it uses? What are the thoughts? What are the judgments? And I would love for you to jot some of those down in the comments over there. That way, other way. That way in the box, wherever your box is. Jot those in the comments. One of the reasons I am encouraging you to jot them in the comments is so that you see that you are not alone and that your inner critic probably sounds like the inner critic of other people. And sometimes that can be really comforting to know that we're not the only ones that hear these voices in our head, right? So jot that down. Think about what it is that your inner critic likes to say to you, okay? And then let's think a little bit about this. Why does our inner critic come out and play, right? So to begin to rewire, so I'm not accomplishing anything, okay? That is a big one, right? I imagine that you are not alone in that voice from your inner critic. Absolutely, okay? So the inner critic, we have to get to know why it exists. And what I believe and what I know is that our inner critic exists from a place of perfectionism, from a place of scarcity. It exists and thrives in uncertainty. It exists in our brain because we've allowed it to exist. And that might sound like a big statement, but here's what I know. The more we focus on our inner critic, guess what we hear more of? Our inner critic. And that's okay when we're just bringing awareness. But when we perpetuate, so I was recently talking with a client who said she was working on exploration of her core values. And it's been a hard exploration for her. And core values is not necessarily an easy exploration to begin with, but it was particularly hard. And what she kept saying is, I just don't know. This is just hard for me. It's just hard. And here's the thing, the more she tells herself it's hard, guess what? The more it became hard, right? The inner critic thrives on judgment. And so, what happens when your inner critic starts to talk to you and say things like, I'm not accomplishing anything, like Eleni's does, is then we start adding other thoughts to it, right? Oh my gosh, I didn't do this. And then it moves from one thing to another thing, to another thing, like a snowball effect. Yeah. And then we hear that voice even louder. It gets even stronger. And so the first step in beginning to work with our inner critic is to notice it, to listen to it, not because we are giving it permission to rule the roost, to control us, but as an honoring, as an allowing. What I know doesn't work is hearing the thoughts of your inner critic and then being like, no, 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 I know better. I'm not listening to you. That doesn't work. Because you can fake it you can fake it and pretend that you don't listen to it. But those little voices, when they're strong and when they've been wired in for a long time, they linger. And sometimes we talk the talk, right? Of, oh, no, 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 like I know that voice isn't important. I know better than that. And yet we still believe it in our hearts. And when there's that misalignment or contrast of pretending to ignore it, but actually still believing it, it kind of like strengthens itself. So the first part is knowing what our inner critic has to say. We have to listen to it. We have to, in a way, give it a voice. Okay. So, what I would love to know so far, for those of you that are playing along, right? Your inner critic says things like, I'm not accomplishing anything if you're a Lenny, or perhaps I'm not very good at this, right? Or things like, oh, I'm not so strong, or this is hard, right? You're never going to be good at this. This isn't going to last. You're not going to keep this up. Anyone? Yeah, that's a good one for me. So when we hear that, we then have an opportunity to decide. And this is a mindset shift. This is part of the rewiring, okay? To truly believe that our inner critic has something it wants us to know, that its messages sound really harsh and aren't potentially what we want to be guided by, but perhaps there's a message in there that we could learn something from. Okay, so this is a big shift. This isn't ignoring. This is what happens when we honor and allow. What I believe to my core is that our inner critic doesn't need judgment. It also doesn't need fixing. It needs kindness. And the kindness comes from listening, from allowing ourselves to think the way we think and feel the way we feel, in order to transform, rewire, change our pattern, right? So if that inner critic needs kindness, we have to listen to it. You have to hear what it's saying. And then once we've heard the message, we can ask it, well, why? Why does it believe what it believes? So first we notice what it's saying, and then we ask it why. Why do you believe that? And why is that important? So it's a two-pronged why, right? Why do you believe that? And why is it important? And you might get a message about, well, this has always been hard for you, or a notice about this long-standing belief you have about productivity and time and success, right? That more productivity means more success. And so it starts to shed some light, like it illuminates or amplifies the old story that you have been trained to believe for a very long time, whether that's from your family or from society, or from whoever it might be, wherever it might be. It sheds light on that long-term belief that you have, and that we can work with, right? That we can play with. If you believe that your brain is really good at storytelling, right? At telling stories, at creating these narratives, then that's the place where you can start to change your own narrative. All right. So the first thing is, what does it want? What does it say? Then it's why. Why is it saying that thing? What is it making? Why is that important? And then the next question is, what does it want you to know? Okay. And the wanting you to know is where then it's like you're hanging out with a friend. And the friend is, telling you this challenge that they've had. And when it starts getting negative, you're not going to say to the friend, oh my gosh, just stop thinking like that. You're going to say, well, why is that important to you? Right? What is this actually about? Aha. Right? And when you get to what it's actually about, then guess what? You can give yourself kindness. Okay. So this is where you then get to think about, all right, well, what would the new story be? How would my inner cheerleader respond to this inner critic who has this need, right? So you get to know what the inner critic's saying. You ask it why it's saying that. Why is that important? What does it want you to know? And then this interim step is, what does it need? right? We're truly being kind to this inner critic. What does it need? Maybe it needs reassurance. Maybe it needs a hug. Maybe it needs light. Maybe it needs clarity. Okay. This is that reminder, that opportunity to then offer it what it needs. And you can do that from your heart rather than from your brain. So I'm going to pause, and I would love to know what questions you have so far, right? What does this make you think of? Does this make sense? What does your inner critic need? So Eleni, right? What answers does your inner critic who says, I'm not accomplishing anything? Why is that important? Okay. When you have that information, that's what we can play with, right? So let's see. One of the things, so another client that I was speaking to recently has embarked on this new journey, and it's harder than she thought it was going to be. And so the old story, the inner critic, says things like, oh my gosh, you're really not very good at this. And are you really sure this is what you want? Because this is going to take a lot of work. And what she realized is that her inner critic needed time. It needed patience. It needed resiliency. And oh, by the way, some of those are her core values, And so she was like, oh, actually, okay, so I have these things. They are within me. They are what make me me. I can offer those back to my inner critic. And then her inner cheerleader was able to say, oh, actually, like, I'm made to do this. I'm made to do hard things. I've done hard things in the past. I've got this, right? But she was only able to get to that when she listened, when she asked the question of, like, what do you need? So these are really important questions. And you'll see that this takes a little bit of reflection. This isn't just something you can think your way through. You kind of have to feel your way into it. And that's the other thing that I would offer you is that your inner critic doesn't need more thinking. It kind of thrives on thinking because here's what happens when you think. When you think, you stay in that spiral of all the thoughts. And so it feeds off of that. It needs you giving yourself permission to be and to feel, all right? And to go in, letting the answers come from in here rather than in here. And you know that that's a pattern with me. That's true about many things that I offer, right? We can't think our way through and or out of things. I mean, we think we can, but that's not really where we move forward. That's not really where we make long-term progress. The thinking our way through ends up being shoulds or things that we aren't quite true for us necessarily, right? So your inner critic needs kindness, and only then can we start to make room for the inner cheerleader voice, right? What is coming up for you? I would love to know. What do your inner critics say about all of this? Let me know. So that's what it needs. It needs kindness. It also, this is a plug for core values. Your inner cheerleader and your inner critic need to know what you stand for. What do you believe in? Because when you know what you stand for, when you know what you believe in, then it is easier to get to the heart of why some of these things are important and what you can offer them in return, in response. Does that make sense? So, for instance, this particular client whose inner critic was saying, like, oh, this is actually much harder than you thought, right? She realized that one of her core values was tenacity, and another one was grace. So knowing that helped her respond to her inner critic with those truest parts of herself, with those things that make her her. And when you come from that place, your inner critic has to just say, oh, okay, well, here you go, inner cheerleader. Your turn now, right? that inner critic at the end of the day is here to protect us. It's true. It just wants to keep us safe, right? And so when we allow it to speak to us, Eleni says, mine is agreeing with what your friend said. And I'm made to do hard things. I always have, just not in the last year. Okay, so let's talk about in the last year, right? The last year has been unlike any other last year. And so I'm so glad that you mentioned this, Eleni, because this is the other thing that your inner cheerleader needs to thrive. Your inner cheerleader, well, both your inner critic and inner cheerleader need this to thrive. And so you get to choose what you're going to feed it. They need evidence. They look for evidence. All right. Well, your inner critic looks for evidence and it finds it no matter what. Your inner cheerleader really needs you to offer it evidence. All right. The evidence that disproves your inner critic. So I talk sometimes about your pride stories, right? What are those things that you're really proud of? Those moments of growth or transformation or accomplishment or being present, whatever it might be. But what are those things that you can be proud of for yourself, right? When we can start to collect that evidence, and I really mean collect it, like write it down somewhere, let it exist, whether you put it in a journal, whether you put it in a container that you can go in and on a day where your inner critic is really loud, you can take a piece of paper out and read it to yourself, right? But when you start to collect evidence, that's what helps your brain rewire over time. When you give your brain and your heart the documentation to believe that there is another possibility that might be true or truer. You're not judging the inner critic. You're not wishing it went away. You are simply offering it another possibility, right? And that's really important. So collecting evidence, whether it's your pride stories, things that are going right. So Eleni, what I would say to you is, right, what hard things have you done this year and felt good about? And give yourself permission to come up with something. And these don't have to be big things. These could be teeny tiny things that maybe nobody else has noticed, right? Lately, I've been talking about medicine dropper doses of what's going right or what feels good, okay? Because I used to talk, and I still do, in terms of turtle steps, baby steps, right? Ripples, dominoes, and all of that works. But sometimes we need something even smaller, and a medicine dropper dose is that thing. And over time, the more you drop, like, right, if you think about a medicine dropper, you drop one drop and then another drop and another drop. And that builds up over time. And that's where we rewire in the continued practice, day in and day out. Guess what happens? If you go on vacation from this practice, if you stop being intentional about it, so too does your inner cheerleader. It stops being there for you to rely on. But your inner critic, on the other hand, is like, ooh, I'll pick up the slack, right? I know what to do. And so giving yourself that intention to really stay focused. So as you're moving about your day, this is why I love brain dumps. Brain dumps are a really good place to let your inner critic come out and play, so that you get them onto the page, you can see the thoughts for what they are, and then you can choose to move past them, right? But we have to give ourselves a way to see those things, a way to hear those things, all right? So, questions, thoughts about this. I've covered a lot, right? We need to listen to the inner critic, know what it's saying. We need to ask it, why is it saying that? Why is that important? What does it want us to know? We need to ask it, what does it need? UPI. Tell me what UPI is. I'm super curious. Is that a fancy acronym? Or is it the spelling of Facebook? Not necessarily what you intended. So it needs these things. So we ask it what it needs, and then we offer it that kindness, that compassion, and know that that's what's going to help transform it. Because when we're compassionate to it, the voice softens. Even if the voice doesn't go away, it softens, right? So that's one piece. The other piece is knowing that this is a practice. You did some really difficult things, but I didn't give myself credit. See? Okay. I was in the process of selling my business without knowing what I'd do next because I followed my gut. That's okay. I figured it was a spelling thing. That was probably a device induced thing. It was hard, but you were doing it anyway, and COVID got in the way, right? There's a realness to that there are some things that happened this year that are real. Sometimes what gets in our way are our stories, are our thoughts, right? So, for instance, the client that I mentioned having trouble with her core values, right? The more she tells herself that's hard, it's going to be hard. So that's her getting in her own way, as opposed to something like a pandemic that comes in and is like, oh, this thing, not so much. And yet, even there, we have an opportunity to say, okay, perhaps not that in this moment, but what might be there instead, right? And that is the really intentional effort that we have to put in to looking for other possibilities, other possible truths. We may not be ready for them yet, right? There's a coach, Carol Lowenthal, who talks a lot about thought work, and she uses this idea of a ladder, right? So your inner critic thought is at the very base of the ladder. Your inner cheerleader thought is at the very top of the ladder, and in between are these rungs. And she doesn't use the idea of inner critic and inner cheerleader necessarily, but it's any thought, right? It's going to have that low where you are now, and then the reframed thought, the thing that you want to be thinking. You may not be ready to go from that bottom rung all the way up to the top rung, but the next rung up might be, I am open to the possibility that X, Y, or Z. Okay. And so you start building the thoughts from there, like you build a muscle. All right. So it takes that effort, it takes that intention. And I'm going to plug the core values in again for all of you, whether or not you have explored your core values. And if you haven't, I'm going to have a way for you to do that. But when we know what makes us us, that truest part of ourselves, then it is easier to nurture and nourish our thoughts with the things that we know are most important to us. So instead of throwing spaghetti at the wall, you can really respond from your heart and from that place of truth for you. Okay, from that place that means something to you. All right, does that make sense? Okay. So these ideas, right? We need to name. We need to honor and allow. We need to get to know what this voice has to say, why it's saying what it's saying, what it wants us to know about it, and what it needs. And then we have the opportunity to offer it kindness, to offer it what it needs. So that's one track, right? And I'd say that's kind of the foundational element of the rewiring of the brain. The more that we do that, the quicker we are at responding, at noticing when the inner critic is getting in our way, and then responding with our inner cheerleader. Still takes effort, still takes intention. Okay. Then, once we've built up that foundation, we nurture that foundation, we strengthen that foundation with that evidence. Okay, the pride stories, the what's working, the what's going right. It is so easy, you guys, to stay in judgment all day long. All day long, right? We are so good at pointing out the things that we haven't done. Elena, you just said that, right? We are so hard on ourselves, so much harder on ourselves than anybody else would ever be. right? What's funny is, so you all know, my daughter's a teenager, and I know that her reaction to her grades and her school stuff, I don't even have to say anything. And I don't love that she's her own biggest critic, right? But it's true. I don't have to get upset. I don't even have to respond. She's taking care of that for herself. It's not exactly the healthiest thing in the world. And yet I was the same way. Now, did my parents love it when, I got a C? Meh, I don't actually know that they cared as much as I did, right? Chemistry in high school or whatever it might have been, not my best grades, but I don't think that it mattered to them as much as it mattered to me. And now, as an adult in my business, the things that I, you know, give myself a hard time about, they're totally mine. I make up these self-imposed measures of success. Even as a parent, right? We are our own worst enemy. And so if we know that, we have an opportunity to treat ourselves the way that we would treat our best friend, that we might treat a child, that we might treat our parents, a partner, right? Much less ourselves, right? But if we start to think of it in those terms, right, how would we respond to the person sitting next to us that is really giving themselves a hard time? We'd listen, we'd ask questions, we'd ask what they need, right? And then we would probably try to come up with evidence or help them come up with evidence of why they're actually pretty good at whatever it is, right? And so getting to know, listening, engaging in that dialogue, supporting that shift, right, with evidence. What are the pride stories? What's working? What's going right? And then, right, this idea of, yes, being accountable to yourself with two things, though. Number one, with grace, right? With compassion, that things turn out differently than we'd planned. And two, with deep roots. And the deep roots come in knowing what it is that matters most to you, what makes you you. And those are your core values, right? And I cannot speak to this enough. Knowing what your core values are gives you a foundation. Otherwise, we're a little bit adrift in the wind, okay? And because I have a stability ball as my chair, I can do that. There you go. So if you wondered why I'm moving like that, that's why. All right. So those are some ways to rewire your brain. And again, this takes time. This takes effort. This takes showing up. It doesn't happen overnight. There are ways you can support yourself, right? So last week, was it last week? I led a workshop on setting yourself up for success with a morning practice. A morning practice roots you in you to start the day, whether it's a 30-second morning practice, a 2-minute morning practice, a 30-minute morning practice, or an hour-long morning practice. Taking that time, the beginning of the day, to nurture and nourish yourself first, to fill up on what makes your heart feel good first, a super important place, and important in terms of being able to respond to the inner critic, right? Your inner cheerleader has to be strong. It has to be nourished and nurtured to be able to face off with your inner critic. That sounds a little bit aggressive, so that's not exactly the right word, but to be in dialogue with your inner critic, all right? So morning practice, super important. Knowing your core values, vital to this process. Because when you align yourself to what is true for you, the rewiring has fewer obstacles to have to go up and around, right? Knots is actually the thing that kind of came to mind. If I think about wires, the worst thing about, wires or lights is that they all get knotted. And so there are fewer knots to have to navigate or undo. So those are some other foundational elements that will help you support this effort. So not only is it engaging in the dialogue and then coming up with evidence, but it's also these other things. It's all so interdependent, right? Our thriving doesn't happen in isolation, right? You don't magically start thriving in one part of your life without there being something that was either a catalyst or a domino effect in another part of your life. All right. So, what I wanted to say about that is that if this conversation of moving from your inner critic to inner cheerleader is resonating with you, if you're like, oh my gosh, I spend so much time in that inner critic voice, and you're ready to change that voice, you're ready to change that story and really start thriving in your life right now. I mean, right now, not 2 weeks from now, not 3 months from now, but right now, I've got a possible solution for you. And that is the Thrive Circle. The Thrive Circle is, oh, it fills my heart with delight, is what it is. It is a 7-week community experience that helps you build that foundation for your thriving by getting clear on your core values, by getting clear on what makes you uniquely you, by getting clear on the practices that truly nurture and nourish you, as opposed to the practices that nurture and nourish me, right? There is accountability. There is always this gentle hand on your back, both from me and the community that has emerged, that will be around you, this sisterhood, if you will. And there's a lot of intention and purpose. So everybody gets, as part of the Thrive Circle, the Thrive Journal. And so each week you'll, oh, by the way, do a brain dump and then get really clear on your intentions and how your core values are going to play into your intention for the week, and then what that's going to look like each day. So there are a lot of really fabulous tools. What I also love about this experience is that it is holistic, in that every single week we're going to tap into our breath. You're going to get into your body, because one of the things I know is that your inner critic lives in your head, and your inner cheerleader lives in your body. And so the more we can move out of our head and into our body, the better. So here's what I'll say to close about the Thrive Circle. We begin on Tuesday, and there are 5 spots left. There is a VIP option where if you feel like one-on-one coaching would be supportive for you, not only do you get some one-on-one support, but you extend the 7 weeks to 12 weeks. And I will tell you that if you have ever been curious about one-on-one coaching with me, this is the opportunity to get it at an unbelievably reasonable cost. So the Thrive Circle by itself, the 7-week journey, is $350. The VIP option, which extends it to 12 weeks and includes 3 one-on-one sessions with me, is $813. The 3 sessions alone with me cost more than that, or are valued at more than that. So truly, if you've just been curious about one-on-one, this might be a conversation that you want to have with me. Because in addition to the one-on-one, you're going to get this community support. And the one-on-one sessions are monthly. So you get one in August, one in September, and one in October. Right? So I would be over the moon delighted to have a conversation with your inner critic or inner cheerleader, whoever wants to show up for the call. If you are curious about this, you can leave a comment here in the comments. You can send me a message. We have time tomorrow or Friday or even Monday, but Monday, I don't know, with only 5 spots, if I'm being totally honest, to see if this is a good fit for you. It may not be, because the people that are a good fit for the Thrive Circle are ready to change the story to their inner cheerleader. They are ready to stop feeding their inner critic. And if you're not ready to stop feeding that, if you live in a land of excuses, I love you, but you're not right for the group. How's that for me being honest? There is an open-heartedness and courage that I will ask of you. And so if that's not where you are quite yet, then I can point you in the direction of resources that would be perhaps a better fit for now. Okay, so just know that I would truly, truly love to have a conversation with you. You have everything to gain by being like, hey, Ellen, I'm curious. Let's have a conversation. You lose nothing other than 30 minutes of your time. And frankly, you're going to come out of those 30 minutes of your time with some questions and perhaps some clarity of your own that you didn't have before. So really, you have zero to lose. So I would love to know what your takeaway is from today. So in this conversation, and beginning to bring awareness to your inner critic. What is your takeaway? What do you want to bring forward, right? To remember what is important to you. And as you type that into the comments, I'm going to have a sip of water. Electrolyte water. It's my friend, though. I've still had some water in my bottle from before and still some electrolytes in there. And I added more water in another tab. And perhaps that second tab was a little bit too much because it's very tangy. Okay, there you go. You saw all of my facial expressions. So let's see. All right. If you're watching this on replay, please go through the explorations, the questions, type them in. You know I'll respond. Your biggest takeaway, Eleni, was to present it with evidence and pride stories. It will help a lot. And I will really, really encourage, in terms of the pride stories and the evidence, write them down, put them somewhere for you to see. The brain is a mysterious thing, and we forget a lot. So the more obvious you can make that documentation, that evidence, the better. So for instance, one of the things I do in my Thrive journal, let's see if I can find the page easily, is there's a monthly progress thing. So I identify the 3 things that I'm working on each month, and then I track them. Right, so I'm literally documenting progress where I look at it every single day. And then there are some other places to do that as well. So I also have an evidence jar on my desk. So whenever somebody tells me that something that we've done together, or a podcast episode or a workshop has resonated, and they send me a message or whatever it might be, I jot that onto a little piece of paper and I stick it into my evidence jar. And so on the days that I sometimes question, like, what am I doing? I just go in and I pluck out one of those little notes and I read it to myself. So just know that one of your comments might be in that evidence jar if you've ever written me a little note or said thank you about something. And I see it every day because it's on my desk. And it's truly helpful for those moments where my inner critic is strong. It happens to all of us. And on different days, with the weather, the rain, being tired, not drinking water, not eating foods that fuel us, all of those things give your inner critic like strength, right? And so we are just looking for ways to get to know it, to allow it, but then to feed our inner cheerleader. Also, right, bonus, what does your inner cheerleader love to do? What does it love to eat? What does it love to read? Right? The more you feed that inner cheerleader, the stronger they will become, and the easier it will be to tap into that voice. All right, everybody, let me know if you have, let me ask, are there any other questions or thoughts? And if not, I will send you off to go have a fabulous rest of your afternoon. It was really delightful to spend this time with you. It's one of my favorite things. And I think I've decided that Wednesdays at 3:30, you can pretty much count on some type of Facebook Live or mini workshop. And sometimes the workshops might be on Zoom, and so a slightly different platform, but you can count on that. For me, it's a commitment that I am making to you. So if you have topics that you really would love me to explore over the coming month or so, or 2 months or beyond, let me know. You are so welcome. It is fabulous to see you. I'm excited to see how your evidence and pride helps Eleni. So please let me know. And everybody, keep playing, keep strengthening, keep building up your inner cheerleader, not at the ignoring of your, that's not the right word, not by being mean to your inner critic, but just by really nurturing and nourishing your inner cheerleader. It will create huge shifts in your life, I promise. All right. Have a fabulous rest of your afternoon and your evening. Mwah. Bye for now.